This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Can I welcome members, officers and the public to today's meeting of the Transport Committee? The main item for discussion today is public ownership of rail. Please make sure that your electronic devices are switched off or to silent mode. And can I also ask guests and members to position their microphones so that they can be heard clearly? Can I start by asking our clerk, Paul Goodchild, if any apologies have been received?
No apologies for absence, Chair, but Assembly Member Mahfouz will be a few minutes late.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? No. Thank you. Can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from the previous meetings of the committee? Noted. Great. We now move on to our main item of business, which is a question and answer session on public ownership of rail and its impact in London. And the session today will be divided into 2 panels. And I would like to welcome our guest for the first panel, who is joining remotely. And that's Professor Ian Doherty, Dean for the Institute of Advanced Studies of the University of Stirling. Welcome, Professor Doherty. Can you hear us okay?
Good morning. Yes, I can. I hope you can hear me okay too.
We can. Thank you very much. So we'll be asking questions from different members of the panel, and I'll be chairing that and divvying that up as we go. But I'm going to kick off by asking what your assessment is of Labour's plan to fix Britain's railways, and does it have the right solutions to the problems it diagnoses?
Okay, so thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Apologies that I am across London at another government meeting, so I'm not able to be with you in person this morning. I'd like to say, or open with a few general comments about the public ownership of rail, which of course is behind the legislation which has been is making its way through Parliament. I think it's really important at the outset to understand the difference between public control of the railway network, public ownership of the operations of the network, and the public value or the policy outcomes in terms of economic, social and environmental development that we seek to achieve through the railways. In many respects, the ownership of the system is the least important of these. So government sets its objectives for all public services, some of which are delivered by private firms, some of which are delivered directly. They are negotiated in public, they're negotiated through the democratic process, and then the operators of those services are held to account for their performance. So in many respects, the actual ownership of those operating companies is less important than the system of control and accountability that the government or the Assembly or any of the other devolved administrations, for example, might put in place. So that said, I don't think that you will find many people now who will defend the model of privatisation of the rail network that Great Britain embarked on in the 1990s as having been much of a success. And indeed, the lesson from the pandemic is that the financial model of privatisation that we had following the 1993 Railways Act essentially it was very fragile and it fell apart very quickly under the conditions of the pandemic when, as we know, patronage across the network fell very dramatically. So in a sense, the challenge facing the new government is to stitch the system back together. That's been slowly happening over the years in any case. The move to the public ownership of the train operating companies will do many things. And I think most importantly, it will bring into very sharp visibility the level of money that we spend on the railway network, which is very significant and of course has increased substantially since the pandemic, and bring that into sharp view in comparison with other public services, which we also know are in need of substantial injections of additional resource. So public ownership is essentially a normative choice on behalf of the government of the day. I think it's an entirely reasonable position for the new government to adopt. I think we do have to be very careful, though, about assuming that it will transform the delivery of the service in ways that people might desire, but will be much more difficult to achieve than simply through the change of ownership of the operating companies.
Thank you. That's a really helpful overview. Thank you very much. So what would you assess as the biggest risks to delivering on these plans, notwithstanding the sort of context you've put it in?
I think there are two risks, though. There's a strategic risk, which is that the public desire for change and improvement in the service is real. It's entirely valid, but government might find it hard to deliver on those improvements as fast as the public would like. And of course, that's an issue which is shared across all public services. You see that debate in education and health, in social services, as well as in transport. So there's a strategic risk at that level of the pace of delivery and the pace of improvement not matching public expectations. One of the more practical risks, and something which Great British Railways, for example, called the guiding mind of the new system, which we expect to be put in place before too long, is that the inheritance from the privatisation, or the form of privatisation that we've had, means that we're trying to stitch back together a network which is highly fragmented. It has become very complex over the years, with each of the passenger train operating companies having, for example, a different set of terms and conditions and other sets of operating procedures. So to try and harmonise those is very difficult. And I suspect that the Department for Transport, government, and yourselves might find that quite a tricky process to negotiate, because across GB we've got so many different train operating companies that have diversified their operating procedures over the years, that trying to reharmonise those and bring them back into a single set of operating procedures and terms and conditions for the staff will, I think, take up a lot of political bandwidth and managerial effort.
I couldn't agree more with that. So Labour's plan identifies an important role for devolved leaders in governing, managing, planning and developing the rail network. And certainly as a London Assembly, that's our sort of long-held position that devolution of rail is very important. Now, we'll come on to ask you a few more questions about the specifics of rail devolution. But in general, what opportunities do you think the government plan could offer to London?
So I think the evidence for the devolution of control of urban and regional rail services across Europe is quite strong, in actual fact. So many European countries are significantly ahead of the UK on this. Regional authorities in France and Germany, for example, have been responsible for their urban and regional rail services for many decades in some respects. And what's crucially important is that organisations like the London Assembly, and indeed the Scottish Government, which has had responsibility for train services for some time, at that geographical scale, the importance of transport to the economic and social life of our big cities is immediately apparent in a way that it perhaps isn't to central government. So, you know, if you look at the policy concerns that devolved organisations, devolved administrations concern themselves with, particularly those at the urban scale, like the GLA, it's transport and housing on the infrastructure side, which are often seen as being the two most important domains of policy action. And it tends to be the case, and we've seen this, I think, across major city regions in Europe, that when control over rail services is devolved from central government to city regional government, there's much more focus on them, and in particular, the economic role that they can play in terms of urban economic development. So I think in strategic terms, this is a good move. One of the major unanswered questions, and this is true for all of the authorities that hold any devolved competence for rail across Great Britain, whether it be the GLA, Scottish Government, the Welsh Government, or the Liverpool City region, even with Merseyrail, is that the legislation, as we've seen at the moment, and the previous white paper about formation of GBR is really very vague about how central government control of the railway will interact with devolved competence. And again, that's partly an outcome of the form of privatisation and fragmentation that we've got. And again, I think we'll have to do some serious thinking about what the relationships in governmental and political terms between the centre and between devolved administrations are, if we're going to make it a success.
That's really, really helpful. Thank you very much. And now I'm going to pass over to Assemblymember Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. So you've got public ownership of rail, and you also got the TfL model of concessionary agreements. What do you see as the different features of the two models?
So, I mean, I would place myself in the agnostic camp here about whether concession as long as it's operated by a highly competent operating firm, obviously, versus direct public operation of the service is better. To me, the most important thing is that the wider policy outcomes that we agree through our democratic processes are delivered by the system. So that's about Rail's role in supporting and promoting economic development, making sure that our big cities have the labour market reach that they need, making sure that the railway network, and by extension the public transport network, is as efficient as it can be in terms of its value for public money invested in it, and making sure that it gives our fellow citizens the range of service access to health, education and to employment and to all aspects of public life that we expect. Again, if you look at the evidence across Europe, I think it's fairly hard to say that one model is better than the other. I think what's much more important is the clarity with which the objectives for the operation of the public transport system are set, and how good the government organisations which are responsible for those concessions or contracts or operations are in the task of overseeing the operating companies themselves. So I have nothing against public ownership. I think in many respects it's an ideal model, but I don't think that it will necessarily lead to better outcomes than can be achieved versus a well-managed and efficient concession model.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you. Good morning. So the rail nationalisation legislation going through Parliament won't apply to TfL's rail services in London. So what difference can it make for Londoners using these services?
I suppose there's two aspects to that question. So first of all, the size of the London economy, in particular the labour market which supports the London economy, goes well beyond your boundaries of Greater London, and indeed in many respects beyond the boundaries of the wider urban region in the South East. And given the concentration of demand for rail travel across the network on trips to and from London, how that network operates at a local, regional and national scale is very important for the performance of the London economy. So I think it's important to say that decisions that will be made about rail services beyond your boundary will have a significant impact, not just on the operation of services that you may control, but on the level of support for the economy that the rail network overall provides for London. So that link between local and central government aspirations for the network, I think, is really important. We may come on to this later, but one of the difficult issues to solve, and again, this is true for lots of similar large urban regions across Europe, is that the boundary issue about who controls which services becomes very important very quickly. So especially with a region the size of London and the economic reach that you've got, that goes way beyond the GLA boundary. It goes across all of the southeast of England. And so the oversight arrangements, the accountability arrangements, either if they're vested in central government or in a devolved administration, to be very flexible and have to be open to the fact that service users will come from both of these geographies. They'll come from inside London and beyond. And it's that arrangement which can be quite difficult to organise.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, because already some of the services that TfL run do actually extend beyond the boundaries of London. The Elizabeth line is one good example. So do you see there being a problem with the TfL rail services being excluded from the bill, or could there be an issue where, in fact, the government feel that the services should actually be included? Because, as you know, for instance, the Elizabeth line is another good example. Again, TfL don't actually run the Elizabeth line; it's franchised out.
Again, that's essentially a normative political choice. So my own view on that, and given the evidence, as I've said, about what works well in other comparable regions across Europe, is that I think the devolution of control over urban and regional rail services is a good thing. I think when they're operated by democratic bodies that are constituted at that scale rather than central government, they tend to be better run. They tend to be better integrated into other economic and social policies that are run from that geographical scale. So I think that the devolution of control of rail services to your assembly and to the mayor is a good thing per se. And I've also already said that I don't have a firm view. In fact, I think the evidence is reasonably solid that the actual form of ownership of the services itself is secondary to how well public policy outcomes are defined and what we want the network to do and the resource level that government is able to put in the network. So, I think the most important aspect of this debate for yourselves is to secure control over the rail services you think are important for the development of the London economy, and for you to hold the maximum flexibility in how you would seek to manage those over the medium to long term. Because it may be the case that you might seek to continue to tender out particular services if you saw fit. That is one of the points of devolution. It's designed to make our political system more pluralistic. And if you think that's a more positive outcome for London in terms of the service benefits that you get from that model, then that's something that the devolved administration, that's the decision that you should take. So I'd be in strong favour of maximum devolution of control of the services to the Assembly, and also over the level of flexibility that you would have in what you might seek to do with the governance and the contractual basis of those services in future. To me, that's the point of devolving decision making to you.
Yeah, I'd like your thoughts on this. The problem we have is the metro services, a lot of them, as you've already identified, run well beyond London's boundary. And I personally feel that there are many benefits to Londoners for the mayor to take control of those metro services, even if they come all the way from Brighton. But the challenge is that for us, that would be a devolution down to a democratic base. But for the people living in Brighton, of course, they would argue they have got no democratic say at all, because at least if it's run by the government, they can go to their Member of Parliament, whereas if it's the Mayor of London, they have no power or influence over the Mayor of London. How do you square that triangle?
Yes, so I agree. Equally, of course, people that live in the wider South East of England region in particular benefit from the strength of the London economy and its labour market and the opportunities that that gives them. So this is where the governance issues become quite complicated. I think the best example of this, and where a solution has been put in place that in general seems to work well and has reasonable support, is the way that the regional services around Paris have been organised. So what's happened over the years is that control over urban rail services there has been moved from the city authority itself to a wider regional basis. And so the way that the Ile-de-France region now works is essentially to have the regional council. And of course, we don't have the same governance structure in the UK, but the way that the system there works is that there's essentially a joint board, which of course is a governance concept that we have long experience of in the UK, which draws members from a variety of elected administrations across the wider region, and they come together to manage services at that wide level. So one of the options that might solve or go some way to solving the issue you identify is if there were some kind of special purpose authority or joint board of the GLA and the other authorities in the wider South East of England region that was able to come together to manage rail services at that level. Now, again, that would be complicated and complex in a governance sense. You'd have to decide what the level of representation from each part of the wider South East was, and what the balance of the GLA versus the other parts of the South East might be. But that seems to be the model that at least gives a forum for those conversations between users on either side of the metropolitan boundary, and brings that to the heart of decision making about network investment.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very interesting thought, actually, and I think that would allay some people's fears. Whether or not that would be a number of different bodies. So, for instance, and your thoughts on this. So, for instance, in trains running into Essex would be a joint venture between the Mayor and Essex. Those running into Sussex, Mayor and Sussex, or would it just be one conglomerate of all the all the county councils in South East and TfL? Or do you think it would be better if it was broken down into those relevant sections for the train lines?
I think both of those are valid options. To a significant degree, that would depend on the operating model that was chosen. So if we kept a model where there's a significant number of separate operating companies as we have at present, but they were inside the public sector, then you could see that a number of joint arrangements which were more locally focused could work well. So essentially what would happen there is we'd have the GLA in concert with some other county level authorities as the public franchising authority for those routes. I mean, that would be quite an unusual model internationally, I think, though. And the wider strategic intent, I think, of the legislation which the new government has placed before Parliament is about consolidation and amalgamation of managerial control and public oversight of the network. So I think to be more consistent with that, you probably want to have a devolved arrangement which was in itself more consolidated and look to operate the London and South East network more cohesively. But these are political choices, and I think both of them are entirely valid and could lead to good outcomes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Assemblymember Prince. Assemblymember Russell.
Thank you. So you've been talking a lot about the sort of the governance and how we can make this work. You talked about the kind of around Paris, the kind of that sort of regional approach. Now the Mayor has got sort of little direct control of rail services in London. So I'm just wondering what new responsibilities and expectations will there be for the Mayor under the new government's public ownership of rail services?
Thank you. One answer to that question from a transport perspective is it depends. Mm-hmm. So currently there is still significant uncertainty about what the new overall cross Great Britain arrangements for management of the network will look like in terms of the strength of GBR as an entity. So once that becomes clearer in a transport sense, I think we'll then be able to have that conversation about the links between central government and each of the devolved authorities as franchising authority. We'll know more about how that will play out. I think more importantly, and this is a really key issue, I think, when rail services are brought into the public sector, is that immediately, and I said this in the opening remarks, the level of visibility and scrutiny of the public investment we have in the network is heightened. And that's because it becomes much clearer about what the return of investment on the public pound spent on rail services is versus the health service or housing or education or any of the other public services that we would like to see resourced. The one thing I would say to Assembly members is that, and again, we've already seen this, I think, importantly in Scotland, and the debate about this has changed since ScotRail Operating Company came into public sector control, is that the debate about network investment changes from what is the optimum profile of investment for transport reasons to what is the optimum profile of investment for wider public policy reasons. Mm-hmm. And that exposes the transport sector to a completely different set of choices and politics than it has under the current model. And that, I think, is good because it forces ourselves to ask some pretty searching and, I think, important questions about the value that we get from public investment and where scarce public resources are best invested. But that can be quite uncomfortable, and particularly for the railway sector, because it is very heavily subsidised by the standards of some other areas of public policy. And that might be an interesting place for it to be for that reason.
Yeah, although roads, VED is, there's kind of, there's been a lot of fuel duty, things like that, have been frozen for a very, very long time. So that's effectively a sort of subsidisation of the road transport network, whereas passengers have experienced fare increases according to inflation sort of year on year. So yes, there could well be public policy reasons why investment in rail actually helps deliver other kind of policy outcomes in terms of public health that might be positive, particularly to our current mayor. Just in terms of bringing together different regions to deliver a sort of functional rail service that works for passengers, we've got sort of in London, we've got a whole load of franchises that are coming up for renewal in this next couple of years. So actually, there's an urgency about getting on with this. Are there sort of any sort of particular challenges that you see in that?
Yes, and if you'll indulge me for a moment, can I just express my strong agreement with your points about the taxation system and how it's addressed different modes of transport and how that's changed over the last few years. And I think there's a really important component of this debate, which is the other side of the coin from subsidy, which is about who pays for transport overall, which particular modes are more or less subsidised, and then what that means for the choices that people are able to make and the cost to the user. So I think it would be extremely helpful if we were to have a wider debate about who pays for transport and whether we price and tax different modes correctly as part of the debate about the future of the railways. So, as I say, a strong agreement on that. I think in terms of the ways in which the transition to a future network is organised, this comes back to the fact that there is more than one valid way to arrange the governance, organisation and management of these sectors inside the public sector. So I think it would be entirely valid as the franchises expire for the GLA or whatever regional combined entity or authority was put in place to manage these, to do that in the way that the government seems to envisage for GB franchises more generally, which is one by one they come back into the public sector and essentially they continue to operate in the manner they have done before, but the ownership changes and the oversight of them moves to a different authority. I think that would be completely valid. The other side of that, though, is that if we had had an alternative model of privatisation, and one of the alternatives, of course, that was posited at the time was to privatise the much larger business units of BR, so Intercity, Freight and Network South East, as larger, more cohesive entities. I think if we'd had a privately owned and operated NSE today, and it was coming back into the public sector as a result of current legislation, I doubt anybody would be arguing to break it up. Because it's the level of fragmentation across the network. We've already talked about the divergence in terms of management and cultures and processes, terms and conditions, and the complexity of stitching that back together again, which I think will become very important and challenging to government and devolved authorities. So I think there's a choice to be made there about how hard and how fast we try and put the network back together. And it may well be that in order to ensure that the transfer to public ownership goes ahead at the earliest opportunity as the government wants to achieve from its legislation, that we do just move to a position where essentially the operating of the franchises or the services stays more or less the same as it is at the moment, but the public oversight of them is put in place, and maybe consolidation into a wider more cohesive regional entity is something that happens as a second stage. But I have to say, I don't think there is a settled view on that yet.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. That's very, very interesting. Back to you, Chair.
Thanks, Assemblymember Russell. I'm going to use my chair's privilege and just ask a quick follow-up on a subject we discussed a little previously around the concession model and fragmentation. As you've identified, fragmentation is one of the biggest problems we're facing on the rail network. Would you say that the concession model as it's run is sort of fragmentation neutral? Because obviously you've said that you're agnostic about whether direct public ownership or concession is better. Absolutely understand that. Does that add any complexity in, or is it possible to run it without designing that out?
My starting point here is that I think our focus should be on achieving the greatest public value from the public resources that we invest in our public services. Now, that might sound fairly obvious, but actually that question often becomes quite complex, precisely because of the nature of the arrangements we put into to oversee service delivery. So, to me, the most important thing that we need to achieve here is the best economic, social, and environmental outputs for the money that we invest in the network. I think the evidence base says that that can be done through various different models. Most large cities across Europe use a concession-based model for significant parts of their fixed public transport operations. There's a whole set of detailed considerations over here about whether that's a metro network or light rail versus heavy rail, and to some extent that's important. But I think this is essentially a political choice, to be honest. And I think strong and good outcomes can be had from either model. And so, I find it hard to say that one is definitely better than the other. I think that's a political choice, and it's an entirely valid one for democratic institutions to take about the kind of oversight that they wish to have of their services.
Thanks. That's really helpful. I just wanted to ask that very specific conjunction of issues. Assembly Member McCartney.
Yes, thank you. And I was going to ask a range of questions on devolution, but I actually think you've answered a lot of that. So I think you've talked about the various models that could be used to make devolution work. Can I ask you, though, what do you think TfL's best case is to government if they are embarking, as we hope they are, on asking government to devolve suburban rail services to them? We do know that they have a history of success in this area, if we look at London Overground, for example. And you earlier talked about economic growth and house building and so forth. Are they the main arguments they should be putting forward, or is there anything else that you think that hasn't been mentioned yet?
Thank you. That's an extremely important question. It comes to the nub of many of the issues here. So I think there's a number of things. One is that the London economy is so important to the UK economy. And the London economy depends on its public transport network to a much greater extent than elsewhere in the country, that there is a shared requirement for it to be as effective and as efficient as possible. So whatever happens in London, in terms of how well that network operates, is really important for UK PLC, to use that language. And I think central government understands that. There's the issue of city regional control of rail services elsewhere in Europe has generally been seen to be a good thing, which we've covered for a range of reasons, partly because it brings the importance of the transport network along with housing into the very forefront of the economic development debate. And again, as we've briefly touched on wider issues of who pays for transport in the taxation system, I think, again, both for the UK and for London, the issue of how we're going to solve the housing crisis, where that housing needs to be, for it to be in the best possible locations that are most sustainable and give the people that live in those new developments the best access to the economy. There's a strong argument to be had for strong London potential to build very many new housing units in very sustainable locations by the fixed public transport network, I think is very big. Something else, of course, about London, which is unique, is given the scale and importance of the public transport network, a unique in UK sense, is that fare box and passenger revenue is much more important as an overall part of the.
I think you have frozen, so we will.
It's gone.
Might have to stop the meeting. Yeah, I'd go.
We're just going to pause for a couple of minutes to see if we can get Professor Doherty back.
Yeah, best thing to do.
Context because of the scale of the fare box and the fact that passenger revenue is such an important part of the overall economic mix for the network in a way that it isn't elsewhere in the country. So that does give a different context and possibly a different set of political realities and legitimacy to passenger interests, in a way which is different from elsewhere in the UK. So I think there is something about the way London works as a city, the importance of the public transport network to its economy, given its scale, and also the fare box revenue and the ability to integrate railway and public transport investment with a wider range of policy objectives, particularly housing, which is unique to London and is quite a strong set of arguments that you could make to central government for strong devolution of rail powers.
Yeah, and one of the unique features of London, of course, is that its operating costs come primarily from rail fares. It doesn't get the same levels of subsidy as, for example, other European cities. Is that a factor that needs to be taken into account, particularly if we're thinking of devolving? And when we talk about devolving, we want it because we believe that TfL can deliver proper metroisation. So there will need to be some government capital costs, but perhaps also subsidies. Is that something that is being looked at? Or do you have any views on that?
So again, I agree. And one of the important things here is to think about the capital requirement that the network will have over the next few years in particular to enable it to carry the number of passengers it will need to do for us to get to net zero. So, there is a wider debate about the level of public transport investment in London as compared to other areas of the UK, and that's not one that I'd like to get into today for different reasons. But the London network needs to be worked harder. It needs to carry more people if we're to meet net zero and our environmental targets. And it will need a lot of capital investment to achieve that. And as I'm sure members are aware, that's because of the history of the network and the fact that a lot of the infrastructure is very old and in need of quite significant remediation, whether that be the physical fabric of the structures, many of which are more than 100 years old, or signalling technology or any of the other aspects of railway operations. So that is a risk, I think, that the Assembly will need to face, because those capital requirements will be very significant and they will almost certainly be beyond your ability to finance directly, and they will require central government.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, sure. Assembly Member Garrett.
Thank you. Just a quick question just that occurred to me when you were speaking to Assemblymember McCartney about the question of the reliance on the fare box and alternative taxation. I wondered what are the sources of taxation that can supplement the fare box? So, for example, I know in New York they have a sales tax that's the city sets that they add to the what do they call it, the MTS revenue. Just very quickly, can you sort of run us through a checklist of these are the kinds of options that exist on a menu that you can supplement the fares with?
Yes, again, a very important question. Thank you for that. So there are some transport taxes. So there's congestion charging. There is a wider programme of road pricing, and of course, at some point within the not too distant future, we will have to have that debate about how we tax road transport, because as the vehicle fleet becomes more electrified, then we know that fuel taxes will decrease, and the Treasury will at some point decide that this is a problem that has to be tackled. So, that debate is ever present. Beyond transport taxes, directly, you have sales taxes. You said you can have a supplement on fuel taxes in the interim, and of course, the precept model which London has some experience in funding the Elizabeth line. But again, if you look at the French system they've achieved in the last 40 years, not just in the Paris region, but in their regional cities, based on the charge they call a versement transport, which is essentially a payroll tax on businesses that operate in the urban region. And some US cities have that as well. I think from memory, Philadelphia is the one that uses that to support its public transport network. And there are lots of options. One thing I would say that is that in general, the ones that raise most money for investment in the network are taxes on things other than transport itself. So the payroll tax that the French use and the sales tax, which is common in lots of US metropolitan areas, can generate quite significant income streams for investment.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. Assemblymember Bakari.
Thank you. We've been talking about devolution, and I just wanted to touch on another area of making sure that there is accountability and transparency and continuity and consistency across borders. Could you just give us your opinion on what lessons that we could be learning for TfL and other organisations that are working across borders with different authorities?
Yes, thank you. This comes back to the point about there being an absolute need for some kind of special purpose entity or governance arrangement that makes sure that people from either side of the metropolitan boundary feel that they are represented and involved in decision making. So there are a variety of ways to do that. We could have some kind of joint board, and again, London pioneered the concept of joint boards for transport and other public services around 100 years ago, and you can. The reasons for that are still extremely valid today, exactly as we've discussed, the reach of these rail services to the wider South East of England region. So, there are choices. It will be essential that there is some form of governance organisation that gives people from the wider economic region, as well as within the GLA boundary, representation and voice within this. There's more than one way to do that. The one thing I would say is that the political risks, and I use that with a small p, of TfL / the Assembly assuming control of regional rail services that reach beyond its boundary, but without that significant opportunity for people who live beyond the boundary to be represented within decision making for investment priorities, will very quickly get very difficult. And there are small examples of that we've seen across the UK around the fringes of metropolitan transport authorities in Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow over the years about investment priorities and how people that live within and out with the boundary are represented. So again, there is more than one way to solve this problem, but the risk that you have to avoid, I think, is for control of rail services to be seen as a takeover of services that the wider regional population depends on by London entities and London authorities, because that will very quickly become quite politically difficult.
Thank you. I am moving on to user groups as well, and the impact that the general public will have when it comes to having a change of ownership. And the main challenges around managing expectations around that change. There is, arguments to say that this will be that would be a more reliable and better service for passengers. There would be improvements in frequency, customer service, accessibility. There's a lot of positives that are mooted when we're debating these issues. So, what is the real expectation that passengers will see when the change happens?
Thank you. So this again comes back to my opening remarks about the difference between public control and oversight and strong management of the network, according to public priorities on the one hand, and the ownership of the operations on the other hand, the former. So, I think you're correct that there will be lots of aspirations for the service to get better quickly, but at the end of the day, the level of service that we're able to provide largely depends on the public support and the revenue which is there to pay for it. one of the myths about the privatised rail network, particularly in terms of urban or regional services, was that somehow it was a cash cow and it made lots of money for private sector operators. On the whole, it was a pretty low margin business, and there wasn't much, and in many cases wasn't any profit or surplus to be had from some of these operations. So the idea that there is a source of additional finance or money that can be taken out of surplus or profit and reinvested into these services was probably rarely true at best. And certainly, given the experience of the pandemic and how that's played out, and the additional support requirements that all public transport operators have had since the fall in patronage due to COVID, I just don't think that applies today. So expectations management is going to be really, really important. And as a general rule, I'd say that something else, that the devolution of services to the GLA or to some kind of joint governance organisation bringing together authorities from inside and beyond the London boundary, is that gives you the chance to do this a bit differently and to have user group members as part of the board, possibly. So there are a range of governance models that you might seek to adopt that would look very different from direct central government command and control of the network. And again, that's often a strength of devolved models, and they're able to bring in user groups and other stakeholders into the decision-making apparatus much more easily at that scale than central government is.
That's really interesting about having that kind of advisory board model being part of the conversation. Is something that we're talking about in other aspects of transport as well. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And those are all our questions. And Professor Doherty, thank you so much for your time. It's been really, really helpful and informative. Thank you very much for your time. And we'll be moving on with the meeting. And so thanks so much for that. We'll now take a short adjournment for 5 minutes before we move on to the second part of our discussion and second panel. Thank you. the Transport Committee and our discussion on public ownership of rail. For this second panel, we are joined by Seb Dance, Deputy Mayor for Transport, and Jeff Hobbs, Director of Public Transport Service Planning from Transport for London. And thank you for being here with us today. So I'm going to kick off with some general questions about the plan for rail. So Seb, I wonder whether you could outline what Labour's plan to fix Britain's railways is on offer for London.
Yes, thank you very much, and it's good to be here. And obviously we meet now with a new government which has set a number of priorities in terms of transport, and particularly in rail, and obviously we heard some of that at the Labour Party conference that's just finished in Liverpool. When it comes to what we as an administration here in London have as a priority in working with that government, fundamentally it's about the passenger experience, and it's about helping Londoners get around our city easily, affordably, and of course sustainably. We do have one of the most extensive and reliable public transport systems in the world, and it carries some 25 million individual trips every single day. Obviously, the government is in the very early stages of developing its plans for GBR. We're engaging very positively with the Secretary of State and ministers on those plans. We are obviously very keen to export the knowledge that we have of running the rail and other systems here in London, and we recognise that in many cases rail services operated by existing train operating companies do sometimes fall short, as of course do TfL services sometimes fall short of Londoners' expectations, though it is the case that TfL services generally fall short less often than those provided by some train operating companies. So those discussions are at an early stage, but we look forward to working with the government, as I say, with that focus on the passenger experience being the #1 priority.
Thank you. And Jeff, what is TfL doing to plan for the end of the franchise passenger rail services on those key rail lines coming into London? Your microphone is on. Try again. Apologies, we have a mic problem. We definitely do want to hear from you, Jeff.
Mildly reassuring to know it's not me that's... what are we doing to plan? So, firstly, we're exploring with our opposite numbers and department about the nature of these bills. So there's a public ownership bill, and then in the future there will be a rail reform bill of some description. We're obviously very, very interested in knowing that the nature of those bills, what's included, what is not. So, for example, with the public ownership bill, we need to know whether that included TfL or not. It doesn't, as it happens. It's the 14 train operators that the DfT manage, 4 of which are already in the public ownership, as it happens. And we're in the early stages, necessarily, since it's not something that's in the public domain, and the department is itself still thinking hard about it, about the nature of rail reform. We know quite a lot about it because we've got previous policy documents, we've got Jürgen Mayer's review, and we've got what the Secretary of State and others have said so far. But it's immensely interesting to know and relevant to know what how we will be interacting with the National Rail Network in future. We interact with an awful lot of it now. It is only too necessary in all respects, but for example, in terms of fares and ticketing, in terms of timetabling, in terms of strategic coordination, in terms of investment priorities, to name but a few. And we want to know how that set of conversations will continue in the future, if anything better, of course, in the new set of institutional arrangements. So all those things we're doing on a very regular basis with our opposite numbers.
Thank you. And as you've said, TfL services are excluded from the bill. Is there a Is that still an open question about any future rail reform that some of the services currently operated or managed by TfL will come under GBR?
We don't think they will, and we anticipate, but the future is uncertain. That's what makes it interesting. But we anticipate that we will continue to have devolved responsibility for the parts of the railway that we have now.
Thank you. And Seb, can you give us a bit more detail about what role you'll play in overseeing that transition to public ownership of the rail services that are currently in scope for the bill?
Yeah, I think it's important because building on from the previous discussion you had with your guest expert, transport, of course, is devolved to London in the same way that it is devolved to other administrations. And so we do have a unique position within England when it comes to the oversight and management of transport services within Greater London. And so that role is one that we already have, and it's one that we would obviously seek to continue, and certainly have had no indication from government that that wouldn't continue. There are obviously issues to do, as has been mentioned again in the previous session, with services that cross over into parts that aren't obviously in Greater London. The board itself has members who are responsible for overseeing that as well, and management of that is obviously an issue, but within Greater London itself, the oversight and management of public transport is entirely within the Mayor's remit, and we would continue to have that model.
Thank you. And I'm going to pass to Assembly Member Mahfouz.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for being here. In terms of the first question that I have was in regards to what the impact of public ownership of rail will be on existing TfL services.
So the existing TfL rail services, we've obviously got London Overground and the Elizabeth Line, which the Elizabeth Line is what Jeff will probably be able to say more a bit about the governance model of the Elizabeth Line, but those rail services are consistently among the top performing in the country. So the Elizabeth Line is second, I believe, and London Overground is third in terms of service provision across all rail operators in the country. So we're very proud of the record that we have, and obviously seek to continue to improve the delivery of those services. And I think it's the knowledge that we have in running those services, the knowledge that TfL has in overseeing them and providing that good passenger experience. That's what we will seek to talk to government about how we can be of assistance in the plans that they have. But of course, we have to remember that the plans are at a very early stage. The government itself is consulting on what a GBR model would look like, not just across the country, but within different cities as well. Plus, you have to then, of course, take into account the additional devolution element that I mentioned earlier, that London has control of its transport, as of course to the other devolved administrations. So it's multi-layered, and as Jeff says, interesting times. But the key point here is the passenger experience that we will continue to focus on, and the government recognises, by the way, TfL's record on that, and anything and everything we do going forward will be focused on building on and improving that passenger experience.
You talked there about London Overground and the Elizabeth Line services. The concession agreements that we have for those put them outside of the scope of the public ownership bill. So do you anticipate any changes for those contracts in light of this new legislation that's on the cards?
No, because they cover the services that are governed by I've forgotten the name of the Act, the Railways Act 2003. Thank you, Jeff. And that means that TfL services would not be within the scope of that bill.
You talked about them being some of the best performing railway services within the country. In recent weeks and months, we've obviously had a number of challenges with the Elizabeth Line in particular, particularly the section that runs through my constituency. Earlier this week, we know obviously there was some impact in terms of the extreme weather that we faced as a result of climate change, but there has been continuous challenges with that stretch of the Elizabeth line, which runs through Ealing and Hillingdon. And one of the biggest challenges that residents in my constituency tell me is actually the lack of communication from TfL services effectively to keep them updated. Had numerous stories in terms of what the impact that people have had, but particularly stations like Acton Mainline and Hanwell, ones that I've raised with you previously, where they do then get overlooked and people are waiting well over half an hour for a train, which in London is otherwise unheard of. What are you doing to ensure that with the with the powers that you've got currently and going forward, that we're on top of these?
Yes, it is an issue that was, I think, flagged during the planning stages of Crossrail, that obviously where you have two railways that you're linking up with a new railway in the central section, that you are always going to be dependent on the performance of the railways either side. And that has been an issue in recent history with the Elizabeth line, with some consistent issues that have taken place on the Great Western Railway. I hope that your constituents will have seen an improvement in the coordination and certainly the relay of information. There's certainly been an improvement in the service provision recently, and that's because the Commissioner, Andy Lord, has taken it upon himself to meet regularly with Great Western to ensure that the issues that they have been seeing on their network, some of which were to do with infrastructure, some of which have been in response to severe weather that we've seen recently, and the lack of mitigation that there's been put in place for some of those issues like flooding. And they are ongoing, of course. But at its heart, there is greater coordination now between Great Western Railway and TfL on the Elizabeth line. But the problems that we've seen, unfortunately, are on the national rail network and not on the bits of infrastructure that TfL directly manage. And that has been an issue that was flagged during the planning stage, and it has come to fruition. Despite that, it is still the second best performing railway in the country, and hopefully your constituents will have seen a marked improvement recently, notwithstanding the recent extreme weather.
Jeff?
Just to add that colleagues at Network Rail have started a very large programme of renewals under the banner of Project Brunel to get the railway out of Paddington to Reading and beyond up to scratch, because it tends to be pretty overwhelmingly the infrastructure which fails, and the time it takes to fix that infrastructure. And that reflects the age and the heavy usage of that particular line. They need to spend more money on it. That's reflected in their funding settlement from the department itself. So they are working through the rather long list of infrastructure problems that are in that neck of the woods. And you should be seeing service improvement as a result.
It's very positive to hear, Jeff. At the moment, we've got, obviously, on the cards, 10 extra trains that will come on board in due course, which will hopefully improve our reliability and frequency of the service. But as I understand it from your response to my letter earlier in the year, Seb, is that still lies in the hands of obviously coordinating, as you said, with Network Rail and so on. So what would you hope from this legislation to be able to ensure that, well, whilst we are the best performing in the country, and that's what we want to achieve both in London and elsewhere, how can we ensure that continues to go in an upward trajectory and improves rather than going backwards?
I think greater coordination, effectively. I mean, we have a good working relationship with Network Rail, as Jeff has mentioned. But I think the coordination and funding for the railway system can be better coordinated by central government, and that's obviously one of the stated aims of what they wish to do. So we're very happy that that's the direction of travel that they are looking at.
So just to add that one of the purposes of rail reform is to simplify the rail network and its operation. There are a lot of interfaces, so in the London area I think there's 10 different train operators, and you have also the different, if I can use the term, pizza slices of Network Rail that come into London. Now, the railway will still need to be managed in some shape or form, and there'll still be interfaces, but there ought to be rather fewer of them, and it ought to be able to coordinate, therefore, that much more simply. than is the case at the moment, where you have to tell multiple people some of the same things, both in terms of day-to-day customer information, never mind the planning of future events, renewals, closures, engineering, the whole shooting match. And at the moment, Great British Railways, the transition team, which is transitioning itself into the shadow team, which will eventually turn into GBR itself, is working out how it can best do that, the nature of that simplification, and how, as a result, the railway will both be better and cost less to run.
So I'm going to move on to what you would both say is the ideal rail ownership model for London to deliver on good leadership and passenger experience. So how would you see that and define that yourselves?
I don't think it's possible to say that there is one model that will deliver the perfect system. Clearly, there are issues to do with governance and the pizza slicing analogy that Jeff has mentioned within the current system, whereby if there is an issue on shared infrastructure, take, for example, District Line to Richmond, or on the Elizabeth Line, where there's shared infrastructure in the western section and in the eastern section, you have three different operators already that you have to liaise with when it comes to sorting out issues that have, whether they be infrastructure or anything else. That in itself, obviously, is questionable as to whether that's the best model. Having one national rail operator to liaise with on shared infrastructure would certainly make that a lot easier for TfL. Certainly anecdotally, that's what the Commissioner has said. And I think anything, and look, we have to talk about what the vision is nationally, really, because if Great British Railway can deliver what we have in London in terms of the integration of services, the single fare structure that is intuitive and removes one of the main barriers that people have to using public transport, which is familiarity, then it will be a success. So we have a lot we think we can teach and share with central government, which we're doing, and I hope obviously that the reforms that they make will make it easier to deal with issues when they occur on shared infrastructure.
We continue to think also that local decision-making over aspects of railway policy continues to add an awful lot. It has done to date, would be my assertion. I noted what Professor Doherty had to say earlier about how that locus helps decision-making, shortens lines of accountability and can make outcomes better. Both in terms of transport, but also in terms of the wider economy, and link up with land use, house building, and all those other things, which are obviously a big deal and a matter of a good deal of attention in government policy more widely.
So just in terms of the sort of the rail ownership model, what we do have is, whilst there's a number of lines that have obviously been referred to earlier that come into London from all over the country, there are a number of national rail lines that serve purely within London, within my own constituency. I've got the sort of Greenford to West Ealing line as an example. What model would you expect to see that take going forward? Would you hope to see that come under the TfL, perhaps London Overground model, or would you be looking to see that go into more of the national model?
So we continue to see a case for more of London's local railways to report to us, as it were, in the manner that the Overground and Elizabeth Line do. So, for example, the services out of Moorgate to North London and parts of Hertfordshire, and also some of the southeastern inners, for example, from places like Cannon Street and Charing Cross and Victoria to Orpington and Dartford and places, Hayes, places like that. We think that empirically, Seb mentioned it earlier in terms of their relative performance, empirically, it's a good way of organising services for the best possible transport outcomes, and we think that it is a more likely way of achieving things that we'd like to see, such as metroisation, and we also think that, as a result, it's a better way of trying to achieve some of the wider government aims in terms of house building, for example.
Thank you. And finally, from me, Seb, directly to you, you've talked about leadership and passenger experience being incredibly important to you and right there at the top of your priority list. Is there a message that you would send 2 passengers who are currently struggling with the west branch of Elizabeth Line from yourself?
Yes, firstly, apologies for any inconvenience that people are facing on that section of the line. Hopefully, the transformation that the Elizabeth line has brought overall is something that has enormously increased the quality of life of people living on or near the Elizabeth line. But obviously, we're not complacent about the problems that we've seen on some of the infrastructure at the National Rail controls, and we are working very closely with them to ensure that those issues are dealt with promptly. And on some of the passenger communication issues, there's certainly been a lot of lessons learned from earlier incidents that continue to see improvements in the way in which we communicate those delays to passengers. But overall, the Elizabeth line is performing very well.
Thank you.
Thanks. Assemblymember Russell.
Thank you. So the Crossrail Act gives the Mayor the power to appoint a public sector operator to run the Elizabeth line. Can you say why the decision was taken not to award the contract to a public sector operator back in 2016? Is that for you, Jeff?
So you've got to take the context of the politics at the time. So the overwhelming number of operators were privately let. The experience of the London Overground is taking the long view. What the 2 operators, their first Laurel, now ARL, has achieved is to get service quality up markedly over the years since we've had let the contract, since 2007. We felt our way of doing...
Oh, sorry, this is about Overground.
Well, the experience of the Overground informed our decision-making around Elizabeth Line.
Okay.
And the experience of the Overground was that we managed to increase usage markedly. We increased, as you would expect, of course, if you spend a very large sum of money on it, but the increase in usage came well before the benefits of investment were seen, in the years 2008, 9 and 10, when you had the disbenefits of the transition, all the works, all the engineering closures, but you saw usage climb immensely. We had both the stations and the trains, even in their old form, brought up to scratch before the new trains arrived in 2010 and 2011, and the big programme of station remediations and renewals took place around about the same time. So we thought that we had a way of doing business that really made a difference. And we thought that this was something that we could replicate with Elizabeth Line, because they got some of the same problems, especially some of the stations out east, Liverpool Street to Shenfield. They were in better state than the Overground stations, but they're still old. They still needed a lot of renewal, and they still needed a lot of TLC, shall I put it? And indeed, when that same operator took over some of the stations, local stations on the line out of Paddington as well. A lot of old stations that needed a lot of renewal, and we had to get the reliability of those services up. Now, obviously on the west side, had all sorts of challenges with respect to the infrastructure, but that's precisely what that operator did, and we saw that experience with London Overground originally. So that's the reason why we thought it was a model that worked well and made a difference in terms of usage, reliability, even fares evasion, which absolutely crashed from about 12% previously to about 3% with the introduction of our London Overground operator. And so taken together, we saw that as a good set of outcomes, which then we also saw began to knock on in terms of the ability to get the local economies working better, house building up, etc., etc. So that's the reason why.
That's the reason why you didn't go for a public sector operator?
We observed a model that worked pretty well, we thought, and we thought we would replicate it with Elizabeth Line.
Okay, and so that's very much what we were hearing in the first session as well, that actually the ownership model is a bit irrelevant, and the what's important is the governance and the service delivery. So is that what you're kind of saying in terms of this?
Yes. In this particular instance, we saw a model that did indeed deliver well, and therefore we thought we can repeat the trick.
Okay, so do you think that the mayor should be considering appointing public sector operators for either the Elizabeth Line or the Overground going forwards, or do you think actually if you've got a model that's working, don't break it?
Lots of different factors. I don't think it's really my place to
well, maybe
second guess my chair.
Of course, the mayor will consider all operators. I mean, the key here is ensuring that we get the best public passenger experience. And obviously, it's very early days in the new government in terms of the plans that they have for public ownership. But we are in very regular dialogue with officials and ministers, and indeed the Secretary of State herself, on this. And those conversations are ongoing. They're very good, and it can I just say marks a bit of a sea change in relations with government in terms of recent years, which is extremely positive. And I'm very optimistic that those conversations will yield ultimately a better outcome for passengers in London. But yeah, of course the mayor will consider all operators.
And would he need extra powers because he's got the powers for the Elizabeth Line, but would he need extra powers for the Overground?
I honestly don't know. I think we'd have to look at the content of the bills that go forward. I don't think so, but I can't say for certain. We'd have to get back on that. Jeff will probably know.
The Overground and Elizabeth Line were taken out of the purview of the National Rail franchising regimes, but there are still powers in the contracts and in the way that it is regulated to have an operator of last resort, which can be in the public sector.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
I should say that the phrase operator of last resort is used by the department. It sounds rather sort of doom and gloom, but there are four of the 14 English TOCs are operated through something called DOHL, Department for Transport Operator of Last Resort Limited, Holdings Limited, DOHL. So it's merely a public sector vehicle for owning train operators.
Thanks for that clarification, because I was just going to check on that. But just if I could just clarify, so you're using operator of last resort because that's what people tend to call it now, not because there are particular restrictions on a public sector operator for potentially the Elizabeth Line or the Overground, or would it be sort of? So it's a question about the procurement process now, basically. Where are we with that, and is that?
I don't think there are restrictions, but I'd have to double check on that. Yeah. There certainly were restrictions for the departments, what the Department for Transport to do, but those restrictions are, of course, being removed with the Railways Public Ownership Bill, which is currently going through Parliament. Obviously, those restrictions are, in some sense, more apparent than real, insofar as some of the train operators have been publicly owned for many years now, like London North Eastern, for example, which I think has been in public sector for at least 4 years.
Yes. Okay. So yeah, understood. So the situation in terms of public sector operator is slightly different currently in National Rail, but will be in different. And just to clarify again, in the procurement process for the Elizabeth Line operator is running now. So is a public sector operator still a live issue? Is that still a potential, or is that not? Given that as you've referenced, the sort of political situation is markedly different than when the Elizabeth Line started running.
So it's still something that is potentially possible. With the Elizabeth Line, you've reached such a stage of the procurement that there's, the 4 bidders have put a lot of time and energy into it already. So changing course would have more consequences, but everything is still on the table.
Okay, so.
Notwithstanding break clauses, of course. Notwithstanding break clauses in contracts as well. So.
In a future contract or in the current?
Current, or one.
Yeah, future contracts. Yeah.
Future contract.
It's perfectly possible to insert that.
Is that something that
again, that's something we're thinking about, yes.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much. Assembly Member Bakari.
We've talked quite a lot about the running of the Overground and Elizabeth line and the contractual terms for that. I mean, I think we've gone into quite a lot of detail about that already, but I do want to know a little bit more about the benefits of devolution on these rail services in particular. I understand that it's incredibly popular with groups such as London Chamber of Commerce, and it will be an impact for businesses. There was a 2018 Assembly report called Broken Rails, which also said how it would have positive impacts on Outer London. So, Seb, for you, what would you say would be the main benefits of further devolution of rail services in London?
Well, I mean, we have devolution of rail services in terms of oversight and transport policy. So the benefits that we have on the Overground network, for example, and we all remember pre-Overground what the passenger experience was like in having different services operating at different frequencies, often not the same operating hours as the rest of the network, not the same ticketing, not even integrated onto the map, the tube map, and the difference that not only putting those services onto the map, integrating them, running them with frequent services, and metroising all of them, but now, of course, we will shortly be seeing the renaming of the lines as well to, again, further integrate them into the idea that they are part of London's transport network. And I think all of those speak to the power of having decisions at a local level that integrate different modes of transport into a single kind of sense of what TfL does, if that makes sense. So the roundel, the TfL roundel, being the overall symbol that unites all of the different transport modes that we have, and I think the Overground has been a really successful example of integrating that into a devolved structure. So a lot of the benefits of devolution in London we already have.
Thank you. Along with the commitment from the government wanting to move on this particular issue, the Mayor of London himself has also said in his manifesto that he pledged to also have a London bus company, devolution within that remit as well. And local authorities have also, talked about the need for more control for bus services. How do you see the Mayor's pledges on a London bus company and having bus operations under public ownership working alongside the government's approach on the train ownership changing as well?
So I think it's obviously important to recognise that both bus and train are starting from very different positions in terms of the government structure across the country. So for start with buses, we were lucky in London that we weren't subject to the same deregulation that the rest of the country faced. That deregulation has obviously created a fragmented bus system in many cities and regions around the country, and it's good to see other cities now seeking to emulate what we have in London. So the B network, for example, in Manchester, which is the most kind of talked about example, but there are others. We've got the new network in Merseyside, and the Warrington as well are doing the same with their bus system. So these are important changes that mean that other parts of the country will start to see the benefits that we've had in London for a long time: a unified system, unified fare structure, branding, livery, recognisable, reliable, etc., etc. When it comes to the oversight of that system, there are advantages, of course, and there are disadvantages. Some of the disadvantages include a slightly hands-off approach to making changes to the networks that can take slightly longer if it obviously involves negotiations with an operator, which in itself might add costs in some instances, and that's why the Mayor has looked at a publicly owned bus company for London that could provide services and take on some of those routes were some of those disadvantages, say, to outweigh some of the advantages on particular routes. Again, you have to look at each case, but certainly that is an option that we would like to take forward. In terms of the railways, obviously we have a much more coherent, unified structure in London, as I said, the overground being the system that operates within Greater London, and we have a fragmented system that operates into London, again using the pizza slice analogy. So if we can unify and coordinate that pizza-sliced system. Apologies for labouring this metaphor, but it is a very good way of looking at the national rail network in London as it is. Then I think some of those benefits that we've seen on the overground network can be extended, notwithstanding, as Jeff said, some of those lines themselves becoming part of the overground system. And I think that's both of those things, whether it be on the bus network or the train system, the focus here is on the passenger experience and whatever we can do to improve it, to improve reliability, to improve accessibility and affordability. And those are the key points that will inform any decisions.
And on that point of passenger experience, there was, obviously in a situation with Sullivan Buses that cancelled its services. And luckily there was a bus operator that was able to take over those routes. But that was an opportunity perhaps to not go to a private operator, but to start the process of becoming a London bus company and go take over yourself. Well, why was the decision not made then?
Obviously, the London Bus Company doesn't exist at the moment, but we were able to have a provider to take those services on, I think, 2 days after Sullivan Buses withdrew their services.
8 hours.
8 hours. Sorry, Jeff. I'm sorry. That's even more impressive than I had been aware of. So 8 hours. That simply would not have been possible if with a non-existent bus company. Yeah. So, but the point that you make is that we had an operator, and Jeff might want to say more about this, that we were in dispute with, and it ended rather suddenly and without warning from Sullivan Buses. So that flexibility, which we have in the current system, maybe we can improve on that 8 hours. It's certainly something to look at, but I think even with the current system we have, 8 hours is nonetheless quite impressive given the notice we had.
Sullivan's let us know at 1600 hours on the Friday afternoon, and we had most of the services running, most of the frequency from start of traffic Saturday morning at 5 o'clock, 0500 hours. And we do not have, because Sullivan's weren't giving it to us, because they have a continuing operation in Hertfordshire from their South Mims, their single South Mims garage. So we do not have vehicles, staff, garages, fuel, and all the other things you need to run a bus company just hanging around. But other bus operators were able to pick up the slack and to run the relevant 8 routes, and indeed from this September the 5 or 6 school routes as well, with very little break-in service whatsoever.
Oh, thank you. And I know that was kind of going off topic a little bit with the buses, but I think it was just an interesting point to make. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Can I remind Assembly members that much as we all love buses, we are doing trains today, and we do have a limited amount of time. There are other times that we can ask these questions of Transport for London. Thank you. But now I'm going to be cheeky and just specifically, I'm not going to ask about buses, no. I'm going to... under no circumstances. Sorry, I just want to return to, I wonder whether you could explain to us the specifics of the way the Mayor and Transport for London have control over the concession, through the concession model of the services provided on the Elizabeth line and the Overground. So in terms of like services, in terms of staffing, could you just tell us, explain how that works and what level of control and to a certain extent what level of lack of control you might have in that model?
So we write down what we want of them in the following regards. Firstly, we say what kind of fares we're going to charge and what tickets we want them to accept. And then we write down what service level we want, i.e. a timetable, for every day and every hour throughout the year. We write down what we expect from them in terms of quality, in terms of reliability, and have a regime to determine what happens if that is better than we say or worse. in terms of money flowing. We describe what kind of staffing levels we expect, what kind of customer experience, and travel environment, and how they feed into what we provide collectively in terms of, say, customer information, which is provided across the piece and turns up, for example, in the Rainbow board or any other of 101 other means by which we get customer information out. Does that help?
That does, yes, that was the question. And how does that differ in terms of the how you run the tube? So just really basic questions here.
The tube, of course, is an in-house operation. We still have some expectations of what we want to achieve. The main difference is that it isn't written down in the form of a contract, and if the tube doesn't achieve it, then there is no money flowing in either one direction or the other, because we'll just be paying ourselves. So that's the main set of differences. Both of them are run on a so-called gross cost basis, namely TfL collects all the revenue, and we don't sort of ascribe it out to individual lines any more than we ask our heavy rail overground Elizabeth line concessionaires to meet a certain usage or fares revenue target. We ask them, just as we ask our tube managers, to concentrate on reliability. That's what we really want them to do, because that's in their absolute control, and they can do most. When I say absolute control, they have to work with Network Rail, but they're in a particularly good position to influence our Network Rail colleagues to fix things when they go wrong as soon as possible, or better still, prevent them.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Yes, and Seb reminds me to say we have more. Our contracts are more specific on more of these topics than the equivalent ones have traditionally been for the Department for Transport and its train operators.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm now going to pass to Assemblymember McCartney.
Thank you. I wrote down actually what my colleague, Assemblymember Mahfouz, said earlier. So you're going to be quoted now. He said that waiting for half an hour for a train, which in London is unheard of. Well, on the services to Moorgate in Enfield, it is not. That's our standard off-peak service. Before COVID, we'd gone up to 4 trains an hour, and I know TfL had done a business case to take over that, and I think you were promising us a train every 10 minutes, a proper turn up and go service if that had happened. And we're now down to 2 trains an hour off-peak. So I was very pleased that you said that you still think there's a case for taking the Moorgate services in-house. But can I ask, how are you actually moving forward with that in terms of lobbying government? Are you at a, it's obviously in the early days of a new government. How is that going, and what are your plans?
The lobbying, one form that it takes is to describe why it is a good idea, and at a technical level that takes the form of a business case, namely we'll write down what we think we can bring to Great Northern and indeed other relevant parts of the rail network, why we think that it is a practical proposition, because with this particular part of the network we think it is, so by which I mean we can say that there's a dedicated fleet of 25 trains in that particular instance, of a particular type, that all sit in the one depot at a place called Hornsey, which you probably know. Yep. And it's a relatively straightforward task, relatively is an important word here, in terms of separating out that part of the railway from the whole of the rest of the East Coast Main Line, which goes to Scotland. Yep. So that's an important part of it, because railways are quite often have, to lapse into jargon, economies of scale. So you want to try and, Professor Doherty said more consolidated rather than less, I think, in his talk earlier. But this bit, it can be separated out more readily and more feasibly, with less adverse impacts and more benefits, in contrast, than many other parts. We would make that case to government. We'd also say that it's run by GTR at the minute, as you probably know. That contract, I think, comes up around about Easter, 1st of April or something, All Fool's Day. Then thereafter, if the legislation is in place, it might well come into public ownership. So there'll be no particular problem around contract end dates thereafter. But it is a long and complicated process to separate out railways. There is a lot to do that. And our friends at GBR and at the department have a lot on their hands in terms of the sheer volume of change in the national rail industry. And remapping, to use the jargon, of train companies is not to be undertaken lightly, because it creates all sorts of big tasks, everything from crystallising pension deficits through to the 2Ping of staff, through to immense changes in IT systems, which I can cheerfully recognise that has all sorts of downsides on occasions. So it is a big task to do, but that's the sort of thing in which that's the sorts of things that we're trying to do to make the case to have greater control over that part of the National Rail network.
Good. And obviously to increase services out of London as well to Hertford and Welwyn.
So we would say that amongst the benefits would be to increase the services. We think that there is nothing less remunerative than a train sitting in a depot, not earning any fares revenue, and off-peak you want to use your assets rather than have them mouldering away. We think that there are ways and means to bring greater reliability, there are ways and means to improve customer information and to bring it within the TfL suite of things that we do to make sure that it's part of an integrated whole. The round all matters, as Seb mentioned earlier, and that we can make more of the railway. What did Professor Doherty say? Not sweat the asset, but make it work harder. Yeah.
And on the lobbying point, obviously there's political lobbying. There's then, obviously, Jeff, you'll be working with DfT officers and civil servants and so forth. What's the strategy with regards to that?
Yeah, it rests a lot on the business case. Obviously, we can't go to government with a business case that doesn't stack up, quite frankly, and that's why all of these different potential services that could be brought under TfL's auspices need to be looked at on an individual basis. That being said, I think the case that you raised highlights the importance in political decision-making here, because, of course, TfL services were not reduced during the pandemic very deliberately. The reason being, yes, of course, no one was using them for a large part of lockdowns, and we all know the history behind revenue hit and all the rest of it. But it means that when demand returned, people had faith in those services, and we're seeing on train operating companies that were mandated in some cases to reduce those services, the demand, when it came back, went elsewhere because the services weren't there. So I think it's another good example why we should have oversight of more of London's rail services.
Thank you, Assemblymember Cartney. And I wonder whether I could just ask Jeff, you've hinted towards it, but in terms of the ability to integrate different modes of transport between the bits of the rail network that TfL does have control of versus it doesn't, what difference could that make if more was devolved?
So we think that the impact of integration is that will make the transport system that much simpler and easier to understand, and therefore you reduce a barrier, as it were, to its usage. And we, in general, see a greater usage of the rail network away from South London than in South London, for example, South London being dependent on National Rail Network. And National Rail Network is more exceptional in the sense that it has lower frequencies on the whole. Its service quality is a bit more patchy in the way that Seb described earlier. And it is integrated less closely into all the other things that we do in terms of customer information and making it as easy as possible. Even the fares tariff is slightly different. Each individual thing might be small, but taken together, the lesser integration makes for a bigger barrier to the use of public transport, and we would rather remove them where we possibly can.
Thank you. And Assemblymember Garrett.
See, okay. Yeah, so sort of following this theme really of sort of understanding in practice what this would mean. Obviously, it's very easy to speak in broad terms about management and oversight structures and so on. Interested, from the point of view of passengers, either current or future potential passengers, what were the benefits? What would the impact? How would metroisation work for those people? And I'm thinking, perhaps not to remind you, I represent Croydon and Sutton, which is exactly one of those bits of South London that is otherwise a bit bereft of TfL, but is quite well served by rail. So this potentially, if this happened, would be, quite significantly impacted.
So metroisation specifically, if you plot a map of where train services offer 4 trains an hour or better, then and you colour coded it, then you'll see that your part of the world, South London, has tends to have much lesser amount of relatively high frequency turn up and go levels of frequency. So turn up and go is a phrase that we use to mean every 15 minutes or better. We do that simply because we see in the way that passengers behave differences if you have a frequency at least that much or better. Many people don't find looking at timetables a particularly uplifting experience and don't enjoy it. I really enjoy it, but I am in this regard entirely peculiar, and many other regards, but most people don't. They either don't understand them or don't want to, and they've got better things to do. Journey planners have made it more readily possible to find out what your service is, but it's not. It's still, journey planners are themselves not everybody's favourite thing to do. So a turn up and go frequency has a lot of benefits in terms of the customer proposition, if I can put it like that. And the purpose of one of the purposes of metroisation is to try and achieve that. And as I say, the benefit of it is seen more greatly in South London than it is elsewhere, simply because there's a greater TfL presence elsewhere compared to South London. So in order to metroise is merely a word that pertains to a metro, the features of a metro, one of which is relatively simple service patterns, repeated all day, high frequency, well, turn up and go certainly, and it has other features as well, but they're amongst them. To achieve that, you have to have the operating principles of a metro, where every minute counts, every second counts. Indeed, if you're on the Victoria lines, a train every 100 seconds, a 5-second delay is enough to start getting things out of kilter. You have to have ways of turning trains very quickly, which you do on the underground lines. National Rail colleagues always blanch at this, but we managed to turn 36 trains an hour at Brixton, but don't manage to do that at Epsom Downs, for example, in your neck of the woods. Now, there are good reasons for that, and often you'd need to have various interventions in terms of infrastructure and building things and tracks and sidings and fleet sizes and all this sort of thing. But whilst there are always practical limits, there's plenty more you can do to make heavy rail pull its weight, as it were, to be a lot more effective. And obviously the benefit of that is that you should get usage up and you should achieve a greater degree of success in achieving policy 1 of the Mayor's transport strategy, which is to get sustainable mode share up to 80% by 2041, but increasing it in the meantime. And it's also a way of trying to achieve wider economic goals, particularly around house building, where we observed that there's a lower level of house starts on the whole in areas with lower frequencies than ones with higher frequencies. So we think that matters as well. So quite how you metroise in terms of the interventions varies pizza slice by pizza slice, to go back to that, but it's variations on that theme. Hope that helps.
It does. So that's a sort of big picture, and I suppose people inevitably think about, you know, the train that they use or the services that they're familiar with. So you think about, let's take Croydon as an example. Obviously, East Croydon in particular, a load of Croydon stations sit on the Brighton Main Line, so they've got very fast services coming all the way from the south coast or from, say, Gatwick area, as well as some more local services that run more locally. How would you see, if TfL were looking to take control of those services, what would you be looking at?
So there's things that we, TfL, can promote and even fund potentially, and then there's things which the National Rail Network would need to do. So in that particular neck of the woods, the Croydon stations, there's a big spaghetti of junctions just north of Croydon, between Croydon and Selhurst and Norwood Junction. And that spaghetti of junctions is a real constraint on what you can do, because you've got lots of, it's a bit like traffic turning right at the traffic lights, and you've got lots of trains crossing other tracks on the level, thus meaning that you bear down on capacity. You can only run so many trains. There has to be a safe interval between each train for obvious reasons.
Forgive me, I appreciate you're talking to everybody. I've had lots of lobbying about the Croydon Area Remodelling Scheme and why it's the most important thing that should happen in the world and why it ought to be brought forward in order to alleviate the huge amount of delays that are caused by that little bit near Selhurst. So were you going to go on to say that's the thing that TfL could fund?
No, because it's extremely expensive, and it affects trains that go all the way to Hastings, Brighton, Littlehampton, Portsmouth, beyond. So you know it's well in excess of our even most plausible purview. So there are other things though. If you want to run more trains down to Sutton and Croydon, you have to find places for them to turn, which is generally doable at the London termini, but you've got to make sure the infrastructure is fit for purpose. So hence one example in your area is London Borough of Sutton have got an additional turnback funded at Belmont, for example. That has multiple benefits because that happens to be an opportunity area. It's near the cancer hub as well, but you can increase the frequencies there because you have more ability to turn more trains more quickly. So there's all sorts of those sorts of things as well. And that's the sort of thing which I assert that greater local control will help to focus minds more readily.
Okay, so that would be additional services. In terms of the existing services, obviously one of the benefits of the services that exist now, either through the Croydon Main Line, the stations on the Brighton Main Line through Croydon, or also, for example, there's a London Bridge service from Epsom through Sutton on the West Croydon side of Croydon. Frequently those services are non-stop between, let's say, Norwood Junction in Croydon up to London Bridge. Would that be the sort of service that TfL would look to retain? So in other words, it would continue to be a sort of semi-express service between the outer boroughs and the centre, or would you expect those services, if you took them over, to become a stopping service all the way up, the way the overground is currently in that area?
So there are plenty of examples. I mean, Elizabeth Line doesn't stop all stations. Metropolitan Line doesn't stop all stations. I got the Chesham Fast only last night, and fast might be a little bit of a hyperbole, but it didn't stop all stations. So
60 miles an hour. Is quite fast.
63, yes. There's no precedent lost, is what I'm saying. So yeah. We wouldn't call them all stations. It's the nature of the timetable. It's not like I can give you and here's a timetable ready-made that demonstrates that. But there's no reason why you would take out all the fast sections, all the non-calling stops.
So I appreciate you can't forecast a thing that is maybe 5 years, 10 years in the future. But your starting point would be if those fast services exist now. There's no reason why they wouldn't continue to exist under a TfL-run system. Great. Oh, sorry, was there something else you were going to say?
Only that Seb points out, quite rightly, that the fast services relieve pressure on the other services which do call all stations.
Well, they absolutely do. I mean, I got one of those services this morning, and I don't think there'll be any point stopping after Norwood Junction, would be my observation. Yes. Connected to that, these services, the Epsom one as an example, obviously they run, you said my neck of the woods. Perhaps the politicians who are elected in Epsom would point out not my neck of the woods, which ends just after Belmont. So in terms of, we sort of touched a bit on this earlier with the previous panel. So in terms of governance, obviously, the people who are in my neck of the woods get to elect me to come here and hold you to account for the services that you do or don't provide. The people in Epsom, as an example, or just outside, let's say down in Caterham, just outside Croydon, they wouldn't elect anyone to here. So have you thought about, and this may be one for Seb perhaps, governance structures that would allow those people outside of London whose MPs would no longer be in a place that they can make representations and they don't have representation here, how they could make sure their voice is heard?
Yes, it happens now, of course. So there are 40 or 50 bus services which go over the boundary to various different other transport authorities. The overground goes to Cheshunt and Watford Junction and all sorts of other places. So amongst the ways in which, in terms of governance, there are 2 TfL board members who are the new board members. So I haven't yet committed them to memory. Peter Strachan and Greg Clark, whose job it is to liaise and represent out-boundary users of TfL services. So that means, in practice, that they liaise with the relevant members of relevant transport authorities who have whose residents would be using TfL services, be they bus, be they train, be they anything else. There are also, as Professor Doherty mentioned, all sorts of other ways and means of making sure that out-boundary users are represented. And of course, that happens now because those out-boundary users sometimes fall within the TfL fare zones, almost certainly use some of the TfL ways of information, and in terms of timetabling, we naturally have to fit within the overall National Rail modus operandi. So we could not, for example, and have not, trebled fares at, say, Twyford. We could not because the fares regulation does not allow it. We could not, and we have not, because the fares feels the regulation doesn't allow turf off all the fast services on Reading to Paddington. There is a neutral infrastructure provider called Network Rail now, Great British Railways in the future, who allocate slots on the timetable in a neutral way against a set of criteria, which are approved by the Office of Rail Regulation, and to whom one can appeal if you feel that the decisions are unfair. And so by these means, by these technical means, you make sure that out-boundary users are entirely protected against what terrible things TfL could do. But nor would we want to, because we have every interest to make sure that those users are as satisfied as anyone else. And that does not mean doing terrible things to the users in Twyford, Sevenoaks or anywhere else. So we want a satisfied and we want a set of users. We want the best possible public transport mode share, and we have the regulation and objectives to achieve that.
Understood. All I will say, not to labour the point, but obviously you would tell us how great job TfL do. We do sometimes take evidence from users, individual users and groups who feel that perhaps TfL, if not terrible, they're not as brilliant as it could be. Just specifically thinking about those authorities just outside, and this definitely is a question for Seb, what liaison has the Mayor done with those, I guess basically the county councils of the home counties, to either warm them up, get them on board, deal with objections that they have to the Mayor potentially taking over those rail networks?
Yes, so we have obviously that relationship already with regard to some of the bus routes that Jeff was talking about, and liaising with local authorities outside London. When it comes to any plans to either take over lines that operate predominantly within Greater London, and obviously again this is all part of working with government to determine what their overall vision for GBR is and how that works with devolved administrations and city regions, then of course we would have those conversations with neighbouring local authorities. But as Jeff says, I think there is a structure, a governance structure that works already with existing cross-boundary services that we would seek to apply to others in the future.
Some of them, I think, have in the past objected, though. So you're not proactively going to them and saying, this is why actually it would be a good idea, hearing their objection, not just telling them why it's brilliant, hearing their objections and seeing if the pitch that you make to government can accommodate the concerns they have.
Absolutely.
Is that something you're doing?
As and when a line is identified, and as I say, we don't have a list of ones that we are going for and lines that we're not going for, and that's not where we're at. But of course, when or if indeed the situation arose, yes, we would absolutely seek their views.
Okay, I think the other question I had here was same question but about London boroughs, but I'm guessing that's the same answer, since nothing yet is happening, as it were.
Absolutely, and again, there will be concerns that you raised about fast services, stopping services, and whether or not a TfL model could accommodate different needs and different expectations from boroughs. In the same way, absolutely, we would consult and involve in the final product.
Understood. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Assemblymember Garrett. Deputy Mayor, can you just confirm, you said that there is a list of those you were going for. I know the Mayor has previously put out a list, I think, in his manifesto. Can you confirm a list of lines that you will be?
No, there's no list, but there are...
I'm sure you just said there was a list.
There's no special list. However, there are, as Jeff says, there are some services which clearly, from a business case point of view, would be easier. And it makes sense, I think, to develop the thinking on some of those first, rather than to kind of have a definitive list at this stage. If
so you could rank them for us, maybe, could you? Or?
I think we could almost certainly rank them on various criteria, but whether or not they're going to be the criteria in which you make that decision is another question.
I think if there is anything you can share with us on that, maybe after the meeting, that would be very helpful.
Very happy to. But again, I just return to my earlier point that the government is obviously at a very early stage on this as well. We don't want to do anything that might run contrary to the government's plans on GBR either. So we make it very clear that that we're on the same page, as it were.
But well, on the same page, but obviously we're here to represent the interests of London. So, perhaps, we may have views and try to influence that agenda rather than just following it. So that is what you...
Which is precisely why there is no list, because if there were, you would have been involved in it.
I meant us as London's government as a whole. Anyway, I'll pause it there before I get myself sucked into all sorts of questions. Assemblymember Russell.
Thank you. And I'm taking us back to the overground. And actually, just this meeting has made me think about all the meetings I sat through in Islington as a kind of Islington Living Streets representative back in the early 2000s, as the plans for the kind of linking up the overground were being developed, and the kind of the excitement about getting to a 15-minute turn-up-and-go service, and the absolute difference that has made to Londoners and made to the way that people get around. Certainly near where I live, where sort of Highbury and Islington is sort of nearby hub. But back to the questions. And this is for Jeff. I'm just wondering what lessons you have taken from the devolution of rail lines in 2007 and 2016 into that overground service. Are there any specific lessons that you think we should be alert to?
Yes, and the other one was actually May 2015, when we took the West Anglia routes into overground as well, and that was reasonably significant. There's a lot of practicalities insofar as the remapping of existing railway management units into ones that can be readily transferred is a big and beastly and deeply technical thing, and it will be the same were we to make the case for future devolution as well. So that takes all sorts of forms, but it's about trying to find the best possible geographical areas in the context of the fact that railway operational geography doesn't meet with political boundaries particularly well. So that comes through to Assemblymember Garrett's point about making sure that out-boundary stakeholders feel suitably reassured that we, TfL, aren't going to do beastly things. That's an important one from that perspective. There is an awful lot around how you transfer staff and making sure that that runs smoothly, because you have 2P processes and things to do with pensions and so on and so forth.
Yep.
And you do all those things in haste and you can repent at leisure. And making sure that there's a good new home for them within the devolved operating unit to which these services are headed.
When you say a good new home for them, what do you mean exactly?
So the last, to go for that West Anglia example, which I say was May 2015, we had to make sure that the staff who were with Greater Anglia were suitably assured that they had a place within the Overground family, and that everything from how services were changed through to their terms and conditions, we were suitably reassuring to them about that, and that the sorts of things we wanted to achieve, notably around making sure that reliability was improved, was something that they felt that they could suitably buy into. So it's all those sorts of things. There's a mass of practical things.
So it's stakeholder reassurance, staff reassurance, anything else outside of those two areas?
There is... there's also a load of transition costs associated with this, which we'd need to make sure that we were able to cover. That's, everything from changing systems, financial systems, performance reporting systems, staff accommodation, how timetables are structured, because drivers have to be assigned to one or the others if you're going to separate out the inner suburbans from the outer suburbans. And you just need to... the lesson learnt is, again, one around time, that you need a suitable amount of time to make sure that those things are going to work smoothly, and therefore it'll all be all right on the night, come that first morning at 5 o'clock on a Sunday morning when the thing actually does transfer.
And so you listed those kind of costs around changing systems. Can you put a number on that in terms of the cost to TfL of bringing what exists now as a current overground system into being, sort of bringing those services together?
Not as I sit here today, because it will depend on what services could transfer.
I mean the ones that you've done.
In principle, yes. I mean, it's a little while ago now, so it would take a fair bit of turning over old pieces of paper and so on and so forth.
Okay, Chair, is that a number that you're keen to have? Can we?
It's quite a long time ago. It's like 10 years ago. So
within reason, in terms of the amount of work it would take to get that, it would be good to have some idea of that. Yeah,
I'll see what I can find.
Thank you.
And I think that comes to the next question, which is, are the finances available now to deliver further devolution in London? As in, you've set out, the sort of the kind of transition costs that exist. So, are you confident that there would be the finances available to deliver further devolution? No, but that's all a matter
of great conversations at the moment. With spending reviews on the horizon and the rest.
Okay, thank you very much. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Assemblymember Russell. And can I pass to Assemblymember Tull, who I was supposed to bring in earlier on, so apologies, Assemblymember.
Yeah, thank you. Is it morning or afternoon? Good afternoon, it is. Just a couple of questions to try and get a bit more certainty on this, because like Assemblymember Garrett, see my constituency of Bexley and Bromley has very few TfL rail services. I think it's in the region of 0 at the moment. So again, there's a bit of uncertainty and nervousness from people in my constituency about these proposals. So just trying to get a bit more certainty. So over the last few years, there's been a lot of talk about merging the tracking with franchises going forward to make sure that the maintenance of the track doesn't sit with a separate body. So my first question is, given that there's undoubtedly going to be a bit of overlap if the suburban routes are devolved to TfL, there's still going to be services from places like Dover, etc., that would come through and operate through London. So who would you see, or in your planning going forward, who do you see as really being responsible for the track and the maintenance of that?
So it's now Network Rail, and Network Rail will be folded into Great British Railways, is my understanding of what the government's plan is.
Thank you on that. And then thinking about, we spoke earlier about the operator of last resort and so forth. So currently the South Eastern network that serves a large part of my constituency is in the operator, or is currently with the operator of last resort. Have you had any conversation with the government so far about maybe taking that on sooner, given it's not in a franchise as such?
So it's in the mix of all the things that we are talking about. The fact that it is owned by, I used the acronym DOHL earlier, Department for Transport Operator of Last Resort Holdings Limited, doesn't make a great deal of difference, except that it means that you're not bound by any particular contractual milestones, but you still got all the same things you have to do in remapping a franchise, from staff transfers to pensions to presumably, just as last time, a statutory instrument in front of Parliament to take it out of one regime and put it into another, to IT systems, to the list goes on. And you know, that's the remapping thing. It took 22 months last time from Patrick McLaughlin giving the say-so to it happening, and I imagine it would take broadly the same were that to happen in the future.
Excellent, thank you. And then just a final one for me, just more on a branding point. What are you imagining that the bid from TfL for this devolution would be? Is this going to be a resurrection of TfL Rail, or is this going to be or would you see these routes coming into the overground network?
I imagine it will be branded Overground. Now, organisationally, it doesn't mean that it will be the same as the Overground has a certain size, and if you expand the span of control too greatly, it will become cumbersome. So it might well be managed in a slightly different way, but it will be branded Overground, I imagine.
So then just a follow-up on that.
Just as there are multiple bus operators, but they're all red.
Yeah. So on the back of that, obviously we've just had the renaming of the overground and its various different routes. If this is going to fall within the overground, and that, are you saying that it will all just be called overground again, or are we potentially looking at a mass renaming exercise if this goes ahead?
Blimey, I'll get into very hot water with my marketing colleagues, but I imagine it would follow the model, but I'm speculating.
Yeah, I mean, we are speculating, but of course, I think if you were to expand the overground, you would want to have named lines in the same way as the rest of the overground network going forward, which in itself presents an exciting opportunity, I think. But just one thing to say in terms of the overground, for example, we have minimum service, 15-minute is the minimum. And the metroisation concept in Bexley Heath would mean, for example, that a Sunday leisure traveller returning from central London would no longer need to worry about choosing between Charing Cross, London Bridge or Cannon Street, depending on their timetable, because they would be able to get a guaranteed train at regular intervals from Cannon Street, London Bridge or Charing Cross. So that breadth of choice, I think, is part, notwithstanding the infrastructure challenges that would need to be overcome with funding from central government to deliver that. But that is an example of what could take place with metroisation.
Excellent. Thank you for those answers there. Nothing further.
Thank you very much, and I'm so delighted we're talking about naming already. Assembly Member McCartney.
Thank you. We know that to have any lines devolved, you need to make a good business case, and we heard from our earlier planning that our earlier session that actually transport is needed for economic growth and for housing in particular. So I'm asking you, has the business case changed between, for example, between 2016 and 19, when the last big piece of work was done, to now? I mean, you know, this new government, its number one priority is economic growth, so it would seem that that fits in with it. But is there anything else that's changed that you need to be aware of?
Yeah, so the nature of... back in 2016, the comparison was against a DFT franchise, and the terms and conditions of a DFT franchise were markedly different from a TfL concession. And we made the case that a TfL concession was a better way of doing business that got better outcomes, and that fed through to the content of the business case. Since then, franchises have... COVID knocked them on the head in large part, and they've become national rail contracts, which are rather different. And now they will change again to a in-house, presumably in-house GBR operator. So yes, necessarily the business case will need to change to reflect the fact that how national rail is being organised is itself changing. The bit that isn't changing is around wider economic benefits and the like, because we still think that a more local decision-making structure will link land use and transport more effectively and more closely than would otherwise be the case, and that one will be able to achieve the objects of policy in house building with greater chance of success than would otherwise be the case, from managing everything from a central government perspective.
Yeah. And I think that last bit of work did talk about a great underutilisation of the track space that we had. But it was one of the benefits as well, and to enable the government to get moving faster on those economic growth tags, the fact that you're there already and you're set up and you've done it. How much do you think that counts in your negotiations that you're having?
Part of the business case is practicality.
Yeah.
There's 5 cases. One of them is management, which is sort of practicality and feasibility. And yes, we can say we can make a difference more quickly than otherwise be the case. If you're other areas, mayoral combined authorities, you'd have to also demonstrate that you have the skills, knowledge and experience within your organisation with which to do this, and we can more readily do that than some others. So yes, it's a helpful thing.
And one of the other thing that's changed is, of course, working from home, particularly COVID accelerated that. Now, we're seeing from a lot of the business news that there's more encouragement now for people to go back into the office, but TfL has been affected, particularly on the Mondays and the Fridays. Does those changing patterns, does that affect anything with regards to the business case for devolution?
It affects more the service levels that you think are right. Now, the Monday and Friday thing is much more about Monday morning and Friday morning, and very much less about Monday evening peak and Friday evening peak. But nonetheless, working from home has reduced the peakiness of demand, if I can use the word, and there is... that's not wholly unhelpful from a transport perspective, insofar as you don't need to plan for a super busy 3-hour period in the morning and evening. It's still busy, and even Mondays in their relatively quiet new form are still busier than Saturdays, unambiguously. But it means the top of the peak has been lopped off. And that's not necessarily a bad thing for either customers or operators in this regard, because that very, very high peak hour was the most stressful bit and the most expensive to serve.
That's absolutely it. And I think the pattern of travel is the key question, not the need to have connected housing and other routes provided, whether it be for the kind of slightly flattened, less peaky, I like that, less peaky travel patterns that we have, or indeed the increase in leisure travel that has taken place by public transport. So it's very important that we do have the provision of networks as part of the business case, irrespective of slightly changed travel patterns. I had a point which I've completely forgotten, which is related to the provision of service. But if it comes back to me, I'll wave my arms at you.
But just to note, so the aggregate level of usage of public transport is a bit lower than it used to be in the old days, by which I mean 2019. That means that, and Professor Doherty touched on this, that subsidy levels have changed as well. You need slightly more subsidy because usage is higher. But what we also observe with national rail operators who've been lent on very heavily to reduce costs. And reducing costs in railways is quite hard because there are a lot of fixed costs. The only way in which you can really make a difference is to reduce your fleet size. So that they've done. And it has reduced costs. It's also reduced the length of trains, and it's reduced service levels in some regards. And naturally enough, as night follows day, if you reduce service levels, then you reduce usage as well. Because the two are quite closely linked. In fact, for every 10% reduction, worsenment in journey times because service levels have got worse, you'll lose 6% of usage. It's an age-old rule. We've tested it again and again, post-pandemic, with immense data sets, and it keeps on coming out that way. So it's sort of slightly reassuring as I head into old age that some things don't change.
Yes, thank you. And Seb, you had the light
I'm
bulb
so sorry.
moment,
It was based on patterns of travel, radial versus orbital. So, as Jeff says, the kind of morning and evening peak in and out of central London to suburbs is changing, but increased demand, as we've seen on the Superloop, for example, for town centre to town centre travel. So I think that kind of network building, and it's very difficult, I think, at present, it's safe to say, certainly in South London, to move from in a kind of orbital way in some parts of South London. So that kind of need for additional links and business cases there, I think there's a very strong case based on demand, notwithstanding all of the other metrics that I think will play an increasing role.
Just to note that these railways don't make money, but you can make more of them. You can make them work harder. One of the things that one has to do in terms of a transfer of responsibilities is to work out what the ongoing subsidy level is. And part of the funding challenge is to make sure that ongoing subsidy is transferred from the department to TfL. And then it's down to us to try and get reliability up, to get service levels up, and to recover the usage which has sadly been lost in some of these railways. Yeah. Not least, I suspect, yours on the Great Northern, on the Hertford Loop.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's helpful. Now, your business business plan doesn't include any detail on further devolution of rail services. What plans do you have in place if you are to get further devolution? Have you got the staffing teams there already, or is there quite a big organisational job that you've got to do internally?
We have quite a lot of experience in this area. Many of the people who have done this in the past, both with Elizabeth Line, with the West Anglia transfer in 2015 that I was going on about, even some old stagers, myself included, who remember the 2007 overground transfer, we're still there. If I look hard enough on the computer networks, I've got all the little charts and that tell me what we did and how long it took. And I'll try and remember it all. So we've got a good chance of putting the old team back together again, is what I'd say, and having the skills, knowledge, experience to do that, because we manage, we specify, lately procure and manage these railways already, and we know what we're letting ourselves in for. So yeah, I'm pretty confident that will be okay. Obviously, money is an issue, but as I said, there's a great big conversation on that.
Thank you. And Chair, shall I move on to the passenger experience? We're now moving on to a section on passenger experience, and I'm going to ask about accessibility and affordability. Obviously, the extension of Oyster card is going to be good news. But can I ask about accessibility? At the moment, if I take the Moorgate line, for example, through Enfield and Haringey, the Great Northern, 10 years ago, we were awarded access for all funding for Alexandra Palace and Palmer's Green. still hasn't happened. Will you be able to improve that?
The process that happens there is that the Department for Transport has an access for, you probably know this, has an access for all fund, and then either the operator or Network Rail are the deliverers and appoint a contractor who stick in the lifts or slope or both. So I don't know why that hasn't happened in those two particular examples.
I've been updated every couple of years that it's going to happen, and
right,
it still hasn't.
It's always 2 years in advance of wherever you happen to be. Right.
Yeah.
So, but suffice to say, we have our own programme in TfL, funded from our own business plan. It's not without its own problems, naturally enough, in terms of timescales which we don't always meet and budgets that we don't always meet, but we always do our darndest, and one would hope to try and better those outcomes.
And also with regards to the affordability.
Lack of outcomes.
Particularly for passengers outside London, would they see a benefit in terms of affordability?
So what we would, one of the aspects of integration that we would choose to try and follow again is to have the same fares tariff across all railways. So at the moment, for pay-as-you-go fares, there are 3 tariffs. There's a TfL tariff for TfL railways, there's a national rail tariff, and then there's a third tariff if you're bold enough to want to interchange between one and the other, which adds about £1.20 premium or something. So we would look to simplify that, because it's one of the relatively small, but still nonetheless aspects of complexity that add just that degree of doubt and complexity and reduces at the margin some of the usage. And so, yeah, we would look to even out those tariffs.
There are always people hesitating at Finsbury Park or Highbury and Islington as to know whether they should tap again or not. So that would remove some of that. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Assemblyman McCartney. And I've got the last question on rail here, which is about, obviously, on the TfL network, you have huge amount of qualitative and quantitative data about what passengers want, and you use that to plan services and also make sure they're sort of safe, reliable, and what people want. Do you have, apart from the things that we all know people want out of rail and transport, do you have any sense of what passengers would want on any potential future devolved services? Do you have that assessment, or is that something that you will want to have more information about?
So we know an awful lot about what passengers want, as you say, both in terms of aspects of journey time, be that travel time or waiting for trains or changing trains or any crowding, or aspects of the travel environment, you know, cleanliness, information facilities, all that kind of thing. And all those values are all written down in a big book for people who put together business cases, and we use them all the time. And we know quite a lot about the nature of the quality of TfL's systems because we measure them. We obviously have things like measures of journey time. We also have things like customer satisfaction and mystery shopping, which are or fault reporting, which measure the more ambient quality of the customer environment. We know less about other people's railways because we don't measure them month in, month out in the way that we do our own. But were that to become a more solid plan, that's something which we would look to do, and that would inform the nature of our improvement programme if and when.
I think that's good news. And would that then, should those plans become more solid, would that involve engaging directly with passengers and user groups of those services that you'd be potentially devolved to TfL?
So, yeah, there's always a big programme of engagement of that nature, and then there's the process of actually sending people around with clipboards to look at things as well. So, yes, both aspects.
Are they still clipboards? Or are they?
No, they're not.
They're probably iPads, aren't they?
They're handheld devices of some description. I'm still stuck 20 years ago.
Thanks very much. And I think that that's the end of our questions on rail, just checking. That's fine. And thank you very much. It's been already quite a long session, but as you know, we do have a few more questions for you. And we have some questions on the ongoing cyber incident at Transport for London. And as the Transport Committee, we are we're obviously interested in the impact on passengers, and I'm sure all Assembly, in fact, I know all Assembly members are being contacted with queries. So since you're here, we thought we'd take the opportunity to ask you some questions specifically on the passenger impact. So firstly, I'd like to ask, I'll just lead off, is that what is TfL doing to understand the impact that the cyber attack has had on passengers?
So I don't usually do this, but I'm going to read a statement. I have to be a little bit careful about what I say because this is an ongoing investigation by a national crime agency and people, organisations of that nature.
Just to be absolutely clear, we're here asking questions about the passenger impact. Yeah. We're not expecting you to answer specific questions about the details of that situation.
We've taken immediate action to protect our systems, and we're really sorry for the inconvenience that this incident may cause, because in protecting our systems, we have had to make some rather difficult decisions, some of which means that we need to thank our customers for their patience. With the support from the National Cyber Security Centre and the National Crime Agency, we identified some suspicious activity on Sunday the 1st of September and took action to limit access. We're continuing to work with those partners to conduct a thorough investigation into the incident. The National Crime Agency is leading the law enforcement response, and as such we're limited in the information we can share at the moment. Although there's been very little impact on our customers so far, the situation is evolving, and our investigations have identified that certain customer data has been accessed. This includes some customer names and contact details, including email addresses and home addresses where provided, and in some cases Oyster card refund data. We have contacted around 5,000 customers who've been affected as a precautionary measure to offer them support and guidance. Additionally, as a result of the internal measures we've taken as part of the incident, the booking system for Dial-A-Ride was temporarily down for a time, although pre-existing bookings were still fulfilled. The booking app has continued to function, and we've also continued to take phone bookings. While drivers were required to undergo a mandatory IT identity check, we had to restrict bookings to one per customer. However, since Monday the 23rd of September, normal phone booking processes have resumed. Due to the ongoing incident, we cannot currently take group bookings or same-day bookings. While we work to restore our systems following the recent cybersecurity incident, we have taken additional precautionary measures, which means our Oyster Photocard website is unavailable. During this time, customers are not able to apply for or renew their Oyster Photocards. This also means online journey history is currently unavailable through any of our platforms. To ensure children and older Londoners can continue to work on our network, we have made the decision to continue to accept Zip Oyster Photocards for under 16-year-olds, throughout October, which are due to expire on the 30th of September. Additionally, we are postponing the yearly address check that we require for holders of 60-plus Oyster Photocards until a later date. We have written directly to all affected customers to update them on this. From our investigations so far, there is nothing to suggest that Oyster Photocard data has been compromised. Children will continue to need to show their expired photocard to staff at the start and end of their journey on TfL services, or as requested. Customers with a 60-plus Oyster Photocard who have recently been invited to complete the 60-plus yearly address check can continue to travel as normal. When our photocard systems are back up and running, we will write to customers again to let them know they can complete their Zip Oyster Photocard application or 60-plus address check. Currently, we are unable to issue refunds for incomplete pay-as-you-go journeys made using contactless, so customers should always remember to touch in and out. Oyster customers can self-serve online. As a result of the measures we've taken to mitigate the cyber incident, many of our staff have limited access to their systems, and as a result, there will be some delays in responding to online inquiries. We've also been undertaking an all-staff IT identity check. We don't expect any significant impact to customer journeys as we carry out this process, but we need to remind customers to check before they travel. In addition, the security measures we are taking mean that it's not possible for us to deliver the necessary system changes to enable 47 additional stations outside London to benefit from pay-as-you-go with contactless due from the 22nd of September as previously planned. We're working with the Department for Transport and the Rail Delivery Group to reschedule, and we apologise for the delay. If customers are contacted by somebody claiming to have their data, they should contact Action Fraud, the UK's National Reporting Centre for Fraud and Cybercrime. The National Cyber Security Centre has further guidance for individuals and families on data. As this is an ongoing cyber security instance on which we are working with the relevant government agencies, we are unable to provide further information at this time. The latest information on this incident can be found on our website.
And thank you. That's much appreciated. And I think some of the questions we wanted to ask will have been answered by your statement, but we may have some clarifications. Again, these are about passenger impact, so hopefully you'll be able to answer them. Assembly Member Russell?
Thank you. And, you know, I mean, I think all of us sort of feel huge sympathy for TfL having to deal with this. So, and thank you for that very clear statement. So I just wanted to understand the kind of assessments that you made as TfL over the choices to limit some services that were going to impact on particular groups of Londoners. So I'm thinking about the Dial-A-Ride and also the live tube arrival information, which a lot of disabled people rely on in terms of being able to plan journeys and that kind of thing. So I just wondered what kind of assessments, risk assessments and everything else, sort of what thinking went into that and what actions were taken to mitigate the impacts.
Yes, thank you. It's an unfortunate reflection, of course, that many people rely on the digital services more than others, and the fact that the digital services were removed as part of this incident has obviously had a greater impact on some groups than others, and that's something that we regret enormously. Unfortunately, it's the fact that the systems were down that is the reason for that, not any conscious decision to say one group or another should be more or less deserving of it. It's a consequence of the systems being down.
Consequence of the systems going down. So when I talked about the mitigating measures, I suppose that's really about communication. Is there anything you can say about that?
Absolutely. So in terms, for example, on zip cards.
Someone else is covering zip cards.
Okay.
So I'm just on Dial-A-Ride, just so we don't tread on Assembly Member Garrett's toes. Dial-A-Ride and the information, the kind of journey planning type information that.
Yes, so the booking system for Dial-A-Ride was temporarily down for a time, although pre-existing bookings were fulfilled. The booking app has continued to function, and we've also continued to take phone bookings. But as Jeff has just said, whilst drivers were required to undergo a mandatory identity check, it did become necessary to restrict bookings to one per customer. However, since the 23rd of September, normal phone booking processes have resumed. And due to the ongoing incident, as Jeff has said, we cannot currently take group bookings or same-day bookings. That communication has gone out to users, and obviously it's impacted on people's normal experience of using Dial-A-Ride, but we have managed to keep systems running where possible and communicated accordingly.
And that communication, have you been communicating with organisations like Transport for All, Inclusion London, groups that kind of represent disabled Londoners, as well as communicating with individual users of the system?
Yes, I believe so. Obviously the hierarchy of kind of priorities, if you like, is keeping the systems running where possible. And in terms of cascading comms to groups, we have been doing that.
And in terms of your oversight as Deputy Mayor, what kind of questions have you been asking and reassurances have you been seeking that those particular groups, the interests of those groups, are going to be looked after, and also just to find out what the impacts have been on, what reports have you sought of the impacts on people?
So first of all, I want to thank the Commissioner in particular and his teams for the regular updates and for keeping me and the Mayor abreast of the latest. And obviously there's certain things that the Commissioner can't even tell me about the incident and the work that they're doing with National Crime Agency and others. The questions that I've been asking are fairly similar to the ones you've just asked me in terms of what the impact on certain groups will be and what we can do to mitigate. And there have been certain things that gate staff, for example, I know we're not talking about zip cards, but that's one example, have been instructed to let children through who in school uniform, for example. It was an immediate measure that was put in as a result of some of the questions we've been asking. So the questions I've been asking are pretty similar to the ones you've been asking.
Okay, and are you in contact with organisations like Inclusion London and Transport for All to kind of reassure yourself that you're hearing from them?
We are communicating with them and providing assurance on the communications that we're putting out, but obviously we can't go into any detail about the incident itself.
No, of course. It's more just about the sort of practical people making their journeys while we're in this current situation. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Garrett.
Yeah, I had two quick things, really. One, zip cards. Come to that in a second. The other was about I think you may have answered in your statement, Jeff, was about the contactless expansion outside of London, which I suppose, curiously enough, links back to what we were talking about earlier. The question was what the timescale is for that, but do I infer from your statement that the timescale is TBC?
Yes, afraid so. Don't know. So there's a lot of work to get all the systems restored. So it's not as simple as flicking a switch and they all respond, they'll all go back in. All 35,000 accounts had to be reset. And now we want to make sure that in restoring the cyber functionality, we don't restore the vulnerability that this particular group managed to exploit. Hence, various things will not be restored in the immediacy. Various staff will be thinking hard about how to find suitable substitutes, and the combination of those two things means that it's slightly further down the list of things to do, sadly, because we very much wanted this to happen, naturally enough, and we haven't got a timeline for each and every restoration, let alone the Project Oval expansion of contact list to the 47 stations just yet. So, yeah, TBC.
Understood. Okay, and the other one was Zip, which I think you possibly have already answered as well. I mean, as a sort of indirect owner of several Zip Oyster cards, I'm familiar with the fact that unless they are literally stapled to the child or their school uniform, the frequency with which they need replacing seems to me higher probably than most Oyster cards. Is there obviously there's this interim measure which I think is very positive, that if someone's clearly on their way to school or home from school or what have you, you just let them travel. I assume, is it the same answer? There's no timeline yet in terms of being able to replace or renew Zip cards?
That's right, yes. There's an immensely long list of consequential impacts, adverse impacts, of which this is one. So the extension will take us out to end of October, I think it is. And at some stage during October, we'll work out whether we can turn on the system and whether we can do the logistics in time, or whether we'll need to extend it further or do something else. But I can't give you which. No, I don't know which as I sit here right now, I'm afraid. Okay.
We'll stay tuned. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member McCartney.
Yes, my question was on Zip cards as well, because of course many children will not be in uniform, particularly, for example, sixth formers or students. And with students, for example, they may be new to London, not have a card at all. And we've recently introduced the care leavers card as well. What happens with all these people?
I think there's a lot more discretion now at the with gate staff. Obviously, it's completely imperfect, which is why we have the zip card in the first place, to avoid difficult situations. But there is a lot more discretion now to allow people to travel without the cards. But we do require people to carry them where possible, so to avoid difficult situations such as that, even expired cards.
Yeah. Thank you. And I'm assuming all bus operators have been told quite clearly this is a policy, because I think we've had some indications that some children are being asked to leave buses and so forth. But can I ask, if people are entitled to a card, but for one reason they can't get it, or they've been told to use their own cards to get in, if they keep those receipts, are they able to be reimbursed at a later date? And is that message being sent, for example, to schools and colleges and so forth?
I can't guarantee that every instant will be refunded, but that is the intention, certainly, that having had the discussion with the Commissioner, that is the intention.
Okay, thank you. So is advice going out to, for example, schools and colleges,
yes,
so they can reiterate
on keeping
this?
Receipts, yes.
It is. Okay, thank you.
Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. I think you may have answered my question, Jeff, but just to clarify my understanding, you talked of the deadline being extended till the end of October. Is that the case for 16-plus zip cards applicants? Because the deadline, as I understood from my email...
So that's the address check, yes, but so you can just continue to use them for the time being. As we go through October, we'll work out what we do next, depending on how fast the restoration of our systems is. The restoration of our systems being a function of whether we can do that without risk of another incident.
Just to be, sorry, just to be absolutely clear, because I had an email from the principal of New City College Tower Hamlets campus. They have 10,000 students across all their campuses, but this has implications for 16-year-old plus children, young people all across London. So what she says is that school children can use the 11 to 15 zip card, but when going to college or sixth form, they reapply to receive a 16-plus zip card. But they can't do that right now because of the application portal being suspended. And the deadline, according to her in an email of last week, for applying was the 30th of September, and TfL's advice to her was, on the website, was that they should pay and then claim a refund. But she expresses a very real fear, and I just got an email from this morning, that many of the students won't be able to pay and will drop out. And can the deadline be extended till the end of October, at the very least?
Just use the old zip card. And there's a lot of discretion with bus drivers and gate line staff, and the old zip card will be fine.
Right, okay, fine.
For the time being, yeah.
Yeah. So it's all gone now. Assembly Member Mahfouz.
Yeah, sorry, Joe. Sorry, just to follow up on that, because obviously at the age of 11 to 15, whilst you still have free bus travel, you don't have free train travel. And clearly there's then a separate increase once they become 16 plus and so on. So, so if they've got a zip card which is out of date, will that still work on the tube network? And can they still top it up?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Sorry. And this may sound silly, but if your issues aren't resolved by the end of October, are you likely to just extend the use of the zip cards again? Yeah, thank you. So that might answer your question.
Thank you. And just one last question on the clarification on that. So yes, people are being. I've had people get in touch and saying they're keeping their receipts. Obviously, that's it might be quite a burden on people on low income. Many of these will be. You said that you're not sure whether you're going to be able to give refunds. What's the unknown in that?
Only because I can't sit here and say every single case will be refunded, because obviously I don't know the circumstances, but the intention is that where people are entitled to concessionary travel and can't avail themselves of it, keep the receipts and they will be refunded. That's the intention.
I think that's a clearer answer. Thank you. And those are all our questions, I think. Thank you very much. Thank you for being with us. I'd like to thank all our guests for attending this morning and for their answers to our questions. The committee has a couple of more items of business to deal with, but in the meantime, please feel free to leave the chamber. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussions?
Noted.
Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with deputy chair and party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting?
Agreed.
Can we note the work programme and meeting dates?
Noted.
The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 24th of October 2024 at 2 p.m. in the Chamber City Hall. There is no urgent business. Thank you. The meeting is now closed.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.